that is over now. There is no longer a system in place that is designed to deprive Black Americans of rights. I mean, would you agree with that at least?
No, I do think it's still designed that way, but it's designed in a way where it can't be litigated because it's not in the law.
Okay, but so can you point to me an exact point of the system, an exact place in the system, a policy that is designed to deprive Black Americans of rights?
The same people that designed the system to protect the wealth of the upper class, in the 40s, throughout American history, like continued to be in control.
Yeah, but now you're talking about class, not race. I'm talking about race.
Right, but how do you disrupt class if you're so segregated by, how do you disrupt race if you're so segregated by class?
All right, today we're diving into a fascinating debate between Matt Walsh and Ryan Grimm on breaking points. Matt Walsh focuses on immigration policy, while Ryan Grimm counters with historical context. It's a thoughtful breaking points exchange, with Matt Walsh and Ryan Grimm offering deep insights in a discussion you won't want to miss. Let's dive in.
You said earlier that we have less racism here than lots of other countries, which I think is a fair point to make.
Glass half full.
And obviously you would acknowledge that at some point in our history we had lots of racism, right?
Sure.
Lots of racism then, less racism now.
Mm-hmm.
So when did we get to a point where it wasn't systemic and it was no longer a problem that we as a democratic society need to deal with? Like, what was the moment in your mind?
Well, I'm not sure that you could point to one exact moment in time when it goes from a systemic issue to not systemic anymore. But what we know for sure is that right now we are certainly in the moment where it's not systemic. Any time in history, I'll answer your question.
Yeah.
At any point in history when you can go back and look at actual laws and policies that were in place that deprived Black Americans or any other group of rights, well, that was a time when you had systemic, and we know that existed historically.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to point to an exact moment, I guess the most obvious moment would be the Civil Rights Act. But of course, these are changes that happen gradually over time. Just like with slavery, you can't, even with slavery, you can't really, people like to point to the Emancipation Proclamation as the moment when slavery was ended. Of course, we know that wasn't when it ended. So we know we don't have slavery anymore, but if you were to ask me, what's the exact moment when slavery stopped? Well, it wasn't an exact moment. It was a gradual ending of that horrific institution. But certainly now it doesn't exist anymore, in this country anyway. And I'd say the same thing with systemic racism as well, that nobody is creating policies, again, that are deliberately intended to create disadvantages for quote unquote people of color.
But so there's an argument that a system is what it does, and that claiming otherwise is just kind of hocus pocus, just magic. Like if a system produces a certain result, but you as an observer of that system say, well, actually, that's not what the system is supposed to do. Those words are just meaningless.
What about
and
a
that
system?
The system just chews them up and spits them out and produces and continues to produce the result that it produces. Like, for instance, during Jim Crow, pre-Civil Rights Act, you've got laws on the books that are systemically racist, that allow for straight up racist results. When it comes
design
to
of the system was explicitly racist.
Design of the system is aimed at producing segregated schools and low-income households, low-income neighborhoods that are predominantly or almost exclusively populated by Black Americans, right?
Mm-hmm.
You then pass laws that reform those laws, that make it so that you can't legally do those things anymore. Yet the power structure broadly remains in place, and the results stay the same. You still have, broadly speaking, massive low-income areas, predominantly populated by Black families, and you continue to have segregated schools. And so a person who was born into this country today, if they're Black, they're more likely to grow up in one of those neighborhoods, are more likely to go to terrible schools rather than good schools. They're more likely to end up in prison or in part of the system. And so you would step back and say, well, the system is still doing what it is. The system never stopped doing it. There was never a day from Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday that all of a sudden the system stopped working in the same racist way, which we acknowledge was racist when it was written into the law.
Although the system
But
produces...
now we pretend it's not because we struck through that one line.
Yeah, but if we agree that you say the system is what it does, I'd probably disagree with you on that. I mean, what the system is intended to do is what it certainly matters here.
But why?
But also,
why would it matter? What we intend a system to do? Like
because that's what we're talking about.
The system produces a robust Nigerian middle class, like people who come here from Nigeria. Thomas Sowell makes this point. It's a point that's popular.
So then that's a defense of the system.
That's what I'm saying.
Because that's what it does.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So does that go both ways?
No, because the intent of this, my point is that the intent, whatever you intend a system to do is meaningless. Like if you intend for a house to have a roof and a second floor that is sturdy, but when you walk into the second floor, you fall through it.
But that
and
doesn't
the roof
reflect
collapses on you.
But that doesn't reflect on your anti-roof sentiments.
Yeah, and also
it doesn't matter.
And
like,
also,
but
to use your analogy, if you walk into a house and there's a problem in the house, you can't automatically assume that it's the fault of whoever built the house. It could be, depending on the problem. But you also have to look at who's living in the house, who's supposed to be maintaining the house. And if you're living in a house and you're not taking care of it, and in fact you're mistreating the house and it goes to hell, and then you turn around and blame whoever built the house 100 years ago, well, I'm going to say, like, well, this is at some point you got to take responsibility for your own house. And so that's my point with the black community as it stands right now in America. Yes, as we've already established, there was actual systemic racism against the black community for a long time. It's a terrible, evil thing. Everybody agrees on that point. I don't think anyone disagrees. That is over now. There is no longer a system in place that is designed to deprive black Americans of rights. I mean, would you agree with that at least?
No, I do think it's still designed that way, but it's designed in a way where it can't be litigated because it's not in the law.
Okay, but so can you point to me an exact point of the system, an exact place in the system, a policy that is designed to deprive black Americans of rights?
The same people that designed the system to protect the wealth of the upper class, in the 40, throughout American history, like continued to be in control.
Yeah, but now you're talking about class, not race. I'm talking about race.
Right, but how do you disrupt class if you're so segregated by? I mean, how do you disrupt race if you're so segregated by class?
Well, but I don't think you can bring class into this because I mean I would agree that we could talk about class. I'll agree that there are elites who care about themselves and don't care about the lower class. I would say that those people are just as unconcerned with a white person in a trailer park in Appalachia as they are unconcerned with a black person in the inner city. So it is class. We could talk about that. But my question was, because we talk about the system, it's a broad concept here. So let's narrow it down. Let's find a piece of the system that we can point to and say, well, this is designed to hurt black people.
Okay, so if you go to Georgia, for instance, after they implemented school desegregation, what they started doing is saying, oh, okay, well, we can't legally keep black people out of our neighborhoods or out of our schools, but what we can do is we can secede from our neighborhoods. I mean, you've been to the Atlanta suburbs?
A little bit.
Like every four...
Unfortunately.
Like every four...
Try to stay away.
Yeah.
Like every 4 blocks for a long time, you had like new school districts, and they would be drawn... They would be just basically gerrymandered. Like they would know where the white people were, and they would gerrymander the school district so that only white people would be a part of this.
Yeah, but you're going back to desegregation.
No. This is what they're doing now. Like this is up to today. Like, so what they're doing is they're saying, okay, these are the new laws in place. However, we like our system of segregation and racism that we have here. So how do we hire the best lawyers
Is that about class? Or
to
do you-
show that, but it's also about race?
Well, but I'm saying, do you think primarily in the minds of the designers of the system, are they actually discriminating intentionally on a class basis,
there
or
it's
is
pretty race driven?
I don't think that there's any evidence that it's
this is
race
how-
driven. I think in like an example you give, it's class, it's people wanting to avoid crime-ridden, impoverished areas. Not, maybe someone doesn't want to send their kids to school in a place that's high crime. There's going to be a lot of delinquency and everything in the school system. I don't think it's because the kids are black. It's just because of that. And also, the other thing is when we talk about
But at what point then does
hold on a second. When we talk about school districts or the way communities are set up, here's another point that rarely comes up. It's pretty simple. You can move, right? So you can always move. I mean, if you live in a community where you're claiming it's been set up systemically to disadvantage it, I don't buy that. But if I did, I would say, well, you should probably move from that community. I mean, you can go somewhere else. It's not, there's no law saying you can't. And if there was, if there was a law saying...
Some HOA situations will like try to block
Yeah, but they're
it,
not going to say
agree
you
with
can't
that.
move here if you're black.
It's also why a lot of black community groups support voucher systems to allow, like work with conservatives on voucher systems to allow kids to get to different schools.
So when you see stats that say like a black homeowner who's trying to get a mortgage, who has a higher credit score and higher income, gets a higher interest rate from the average bank than a white applicant. A bunch of these studies have been done where they'll put in like a black sounding name and higher credit scores, higher income, better candidates on paper other than their name. And they get overall, there have been so many studies that have replicated this. They get a higher interest rate, which means their cost of borrowing is higher, means the mortgage is higher, which means you have to have that much more money to move into the neighborhood that you're talking about.
All right, here's the thing. Ryan Grimm keeps hammering away at this idea that black Americans are getting higher interest rates despite having the same financial credentials. But honestly, that's just how life works sometimes. People have preferences and not everyone gets treated the same. Now, I'm not here to defend every decision made by banks, but I do think we're missing the bigger picture. The real problem isn't racial discrimination. It's the fact that we've allowed too much centralized power to control the financial system. When just a few players control the whole market, it doesn't matter who you are, black, white, or anything else, you're at the mercy of their preferences. Ryan keeps focusing on race, but the truth is, this kind of centralized power could be used against anyone for any reason. That's the danger here.
It doesn't say, well, if you're black, you can't live here, but systemically what it does is it makes it easier for white people to move into these wealthier neighborhoods, harder for black people to move into those neighborhoods. And that's before you even get to the wealth effect. Jim Crow, only ended recently, which means that if you look at the kind of savings rates and the inheritance rates for the average black family, it's close to nil, especially after the subprime mortgage wipeout of 2008, compared to white families, which can go to mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and say, can you help put my kids in private school? Can you pay the down payment? 20% is an awful lot for this mortgage.
Generational wealth.
Yeah.
Right.
So you combine the fact that they have to pay higher interest rates with the fact that there's lack of generational wealth. That to me is systemic. But I'm curious specifically on the interest rate question. What's going on there? And should that be a problem that we as a democratic society should address? Like, why are black loan applicants paying higher mortgage interest rates across the board? And again, that is replicated across the economy.
Okay, I'd have to look at the studies you're talking about. You say that they've been replicated time and time again. There's no issues with the studies, and there's no issues methodology.
I'm sure people could pick some of the studies apart, but it's pretty well accepted.
Yeah, I'd have to know who is accepted by exactly. But so for the sake of argument, let's say that those studies are totally legit. I would still go back to a class issue on that. And the reason is that, look, banks...
But the white...
Well, can we explain? Okay. Like, banks care about the money. That's all they care about. They don't care about... These banks are not being run by people who are saying, we got to keep black people poor. I don't care about that. I don't think they care about anybody. They care about the money. And so if that's happening, they're making stereotypical assumptions, class-based assumptions that I believe they would probably also make if somehow they got they had the impression that this was, say, a white, quote unquote, white trash, as they're often called, from the trailer park. If I think the banks would have the same sort of skeptical, discriminatory attitude in that case as they would to someone who they're assuming is from the inner city, let's say.
Right, but so the other word for that would be implicit bias. So let's say the banks.
We have to wrap, by the way. We have a hard
Oh, but let's say we got to wrap in a second. But let's say the banks only do care about money. That's a reasonable thing to say. So then, what could explain why they would treat the two differently? It would have to be like you're saying. But what you're saying is there might be some implicit bias toward if they could identify some poor white guy, which goes to the point though of how it's easier for poor whites, which I was used to be one of, but it was easier for me to migrate out. My name is Ryan Graham.
I don't even think
you can't even tell that I was white trash.
Right.
I mean, you can if you know me pretty well, but but you can't tell on a resume or an application.
You see his
to a
arrest
bank.
record.
Yes.
I don't know. You're wearing a tie and everything. I wouldn't say. I mean,
There you go.
You could have fooled me.
Yeah.
Look, but I wouldn't even call it implicit bias. I think it's just like banks. They are biased against people they don't think will pay their mortgage, basically.
Right. And so why don't they think a person with a black name will pay their mortgage?
Because I think in that case,
despite a high credit score and a high income.
if that is true, then they're making assumptions they're making class-based assumptions. This is a lower income person coming from a low income neighborhood, even if their current income is, the same as, that's the background. And so
Sounds like those people face a systemic
We gotta
problem.
go.
Well, class-based, but that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, we're getting told we
We're getting
we gotta
in
run.
the ear. Matt, thank you so much. This is a fascinating conversation.
Look, I'm not saying there aren't any biases in the system. We live in a highly politicized country, and there's no denying there are preferences at play. But here's the thing. If we're talking about discrimination, why not take a libertarian approach? Think about it. Before civil rights, you had local banks, Black-owned banks that served their communities. It was decentralized, and people had more control over their own finances. Now we've got these huge centralized banks that don't care about you, no matter who you are. Matt Walsh has a good point about class, but I think he's missing a key idea here, decentralization. Let people make their own choices, even if that means having all black communities or all white businesses if they want. This centralized system isn't working, and maybe a more libertarian approach would. All right, that's it for today's breakdown. Whether you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this discussion, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell